Welcome to week 11, everyone. If you haven't lost your faith in humanity just yet, I have a feeling you might after this lecture series. We're going to extend our discussion of social identity theory and then apply it to workplace bullying. Personally, I'm a strong advocate for anti-bullying policies in workplaces. People can be, well, let's face it, so evil. Over to you, Professor.
Thanks, Irving. Yep, we're really moving into some dark territory now. You all know, I'm sure, that bullying is very common on the school playground. Children, of course, can be sweet and innocent, sure, but they can also be extremely cruel. But what you might not know is that bullying is also very common in the workplace. This is typically very different from playground bullying. For example, it's uncommon in workplace bullying for it to involve physical violence. But the effects of bullying at work are just as devastating, if not more so. Another key feature of workplace bullying is that it is often subtle and hard to detect, unless, of course, you are the victim, in which case it's very clear that you are a target. So, what we're going to do today is to first look at the social psychological underpinnings of workplace bullying. There are a series of classical experiments that can explain, but certainly not justify, bullying behavior. Then, in the second lecture, we're going to look at workplace bullying and the mobbing process. So, as Irving said, this is likely to be a fairly disturbing lecture series. But remember, just because we can explain why human behavior can be so cruel does not mean that we have to accept and tolerate such cruelty. We can all work towards a workplace culture based on dignity and mutual respect. All right, so let's get started with the lecture, shall we? Here we are at week 11. This week, we will be learning about the social psychological foundations of workplace bullying behavior. In order to really understand why bullying at work is so prevalent as a phenomenon, we have to start by looking at some classical experiments in social psychology. It's likely that you have already heard of these experiments, or at least some of them. They were truly groundbreaking studies into the nature of human behavior. Because they are so controversial, we cannot replicate some of these experiments. They have, you'll see, the potential to cause harm to the subjects. And universities have broadly decided that the potential for harm outweighs the advances that we can make in terms of understanding human behavior. So we don't know exactly how well these principles hold up in contemporary society, but it is likely that they are still quite valid. First, let's talk about what we've learned thus far in this course. We spent the first half of the semester learning about Goffman's dramaturgy. I warned everyone that after reading Goffman, you would likely go away thinking that people generally can't be trusted. I don't know if we can go so far as to say that Goffman's framework is disturbing. Maybe to some people it is. But mostly I think it's disappointing to think about people as selfish and disingenuous actors. Then we moved on to look at Tajfel's social identity theory. Now, social identity theory is perhaps more disturbing than dramaturgy. We learned that people divide themselves into social groups, exaggerate differences between those groups, and then often devalue members of the outgroup. We also learned that much of the conflict across human history is grounded in these in-group, out-group divisions. That is, in itself, I think, pretty dark. But now we're going to look at what I think is an even darker view of human nature. It is arguably an extension of social identity theory. The Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment, also known as the Zimbardo experiment, showed how even Normal people like you and me are capable of extraordinary evil. That doesn't necessarily make us evil people, of course. We are also capable of extraordinary good, but the experiments that we'll look at here show that we are all capable of inflicting significant harm on each other in the right circumstances. What is it about psychologists and line experiments? I'm sure you remember Tajfal's famous line experiment where he developed accentuation theory. Well, Solomon Asch did another line experiment, and this one is even more famous. The so-called line conformity experiment essentially laid the foundation for Milgram and Zimbardo's experiments. So before we dive into those two studies, I want to spend a bit of time explaining the Asch experiment first. So what happens here is that an unwitting participant enters a room with 7 confederates. A confederate is someone who works for the experimenter and is part of the experiment. The real participant has no idea that the other 7 are confederates. Now, all 8 subjects in the room are shown 4 lines. They are then asked to identify which one of 3 lines is identical to the 4th line. The 7 confederates, as an essential part of the experiment, are instructed by the experimenter to intentionally choose the wrong length of lines. The aim of the experiment is essentially to see if peer pressure can convince the real participant just to go along with the rest of the group, knowing full well that they are wrong. In about 1/3 of cases, the real participant agreed with the incorrect choices. The key result here is that groups are very powerful. We often go along with the group even if we're sure that they are wrong. The implications for bullying in this finding are pretty clear if you think about it. Let's take a look at a short clip explaining the Asch experiment.
The Asch experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
the actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1.
2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3.
3.
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
1. 1. 1.
1. Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
Another important study in the history of psychology that's a precursor to Milgram and Zimbardo's experiments is Adorno et al.'s book on the authoritarian personality. This was not an experiment per se, but rather a study that led to the design of a survey instrument that the authors argue can measure individual authoritarian tendencies. Let me give you a little context to this study. Adorno and his colleagues were Jewish scholars who fled Germany during World War II for obvious reasons. Many of them resettled in the United States, and together they became known as the Frankfurt School. They were critical theorists, many of them Marxists. This particular study was motivated by an attempt to explain the Holocaust and the horrors of World War II. Adorno and his colleagues were trying to figure out how an entire society of normal, everyday people, businessmen, housewives, blue-collar workers, children, etc., could tolerate and indeed endorse the extermination of millions of people. This was an important question for social scientists to address after World War II. Why did so many people lend their support to a murderous ideology built on hatred of the other? Adorno and his colleagues developed a survey instrument which they labeled the F scale. They claimed that it could measure authoritarian tendencies and that these traits were much more widespread than previously thought. In short, they argue that many people suffer from an authoritarian personality. Such people are obsessed with subservience to authority and are only happy when they submit to a higher power. The authors argue that such people are the reason why so many Germans supported the Nazi Party. If you'd like to take the survey yourself, I've posted a link to it at the bottom of this slide. Now, both the Asch experiment and the authoritarian personality study say something important about the principle of obedience in society. Whilst obviously obedience to authority can go too far, at the same time we need to recognize that obedience is a necessary condition of society. Without obedience, we only have anarchy. So, obedience isn't a bad thing per se. All societies are structured to reward obedience and to punish disobedience, some more than others, of course. For example, all societies have laws that govern our behavior, and we expect everyone to obey those laws or to suffer the consequences. In a similar vein, workplaces are also structured to reward obedience and to punish disobedience. Most workplaces have policies and procedures in place to deal with employee misconduct. Employers have a right to shape our behavior at work. As employees, we give them this right in exchange for a wage. And when we misbehave as employees, the organization can then leverage its power to effectively disemploy us. More hierarchical organizations, like the military, obviously have higher standards for obedience. Failure to obey an order from a superior officer can have severe consequences up to and including imprisonment. But in most organizations, obedience is based on social control and coercion. So social control means that norms shape people's behavior, and coercion means that when formal rules are broken, sanctions apply as a form of corrective action. Ironically, one of those sanctions is workplace bullying. Okay, so we finally arrived at Milgram's experiment. This is one that we are no longer allowed to replicate because of the potential for harm to subjects. In this experiment, subjects were ordered to administer an electric shock to someone. A simulated shock generator was used with voltage levels from 15 volts to 450 volts. Of course, the machine doesn't really administer any shock at all, but from the point of view of the subject, it does. At the beginning of the experiment, the subject sees the victim become essentially strapped down to a chair with an electrode paste applied, quote, to avoid blisters and burns, end quote. The machine that the subject is told to use is labeled from slight shock all the way up to danger severe shock. The subjects were first given a small sample shock of 45 volts so that they accepted the authenticity of the generator. As the experiment unfolds, the subject is told by the experimenter to administer increasingly more intense shocks to the victim. Obedience in this context is defined as compliance with the command to administer the shocks. In contrast, disobedience is defined as a failure to comply with the command to administer the shocks. The victim, and of course I put that in quotation marks, isn't really being shocked at all. He's located in an adjacent room and is simply instructed to verbalize increasing discomfort after each false shock and to pound on the wall, for example. The experimenter derives his authority by wearing a lab technician's coat. He was instructed to give the following prods in the event of noncompliance. So the first prod is the experimenter saying, "Please continue." The second prod is the experiment requires that you continue. The third prod is it is absolutely essential that you continue. And the fourth and final prod has the experimenter saying, "You have no other choice, you must go on." Before I report the results of the experiment to you, I'd like you to take a moment to think about how you might react if you were participating in this experiment. These are perhaps the most shocking, excuse the pun, results of any psychology experiment in the history of the discipline. Now, before the experiment, psychology students were asked to guess what percent of subjects would administer all 30 levels of shocks. Various classes estimated that between 0%, that is no one, and 3% of subjects would go all the way to the highest shock. At the beginning of the experiment, the shocks were very minor and most subjects were able to administer them without any serious problems. But as the subjects began to administer more intense shocks, they also began to visibly sweat, tremble, stutter, bite their lips, groan, dig their fingernails into their flesh, and laugh uncontrollably. These were all observations made by the scientists carrying out the experiments. Out of the 40 subjects to participate in this experiment, 26 of them administered all of the shocks, up to 450 volts. That means that 65% of the subjects were willing to administer life-threatening shocks to an unknown person. One subject stopped at danger severe shock, 8 subjects stopped at extreme intensity shock, 5 subjects stopped at intense shock. One of the subjects went into convulsions, and so the experiment had to be halted for health and safety reasons. Now I want you to think about these results for a minute. What does this experiment say about us and our willingness to inflict significant harm on each other? We all know from childhood that it's wrong to hurt another person. By the time we are adults, we know that it's even illegal to injure another person, and that we can go to prison if we hurt or kill someone. But for whatever reason, 65% of the subjects in Milgram's experiment abandoned their morals and their sense of right and wrong in order to follow the commands of what they perceived to be an authority figure. In fact, this authority figure, just a man in a lab coat, had no special powers to enforce the commands. Furthermore, there were no consequences for failure to obey the experimenter. Even then, most subjects still couldn't resist the need to obey. And even when the subjects became emotionally distraught by the experiment, they still couldn't stop themselves from obedience. It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? I think the key takeaway from Milgram's experiment is that there's a key conflict between our disposition to do no harm and our disposition to obey authority. It would appear that we would rather submit to authority and obey than to adhere to our moral compass. Wow. Just think about that. Let's watch a short clip of the experiment so that you can get a better feel for it.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're going to get a shot. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man, eh? I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. And
2/3 of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Here's another experiment that we are no longer allowed to replicate. No university would ever let us recreate the Stanford Prison Experiment again because of the risk of harm to participants. This experiment, spearheaded by Professor Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University in California, was conducted in 1971. Like Milgram's study, this is one of the most famous of psychology experiments. They even made a Hollywood picture about it called The Experiment. Now, in the real experiment, 24 young men, mostly students, were recruited to participate in a prison simulation environment. The subjects were randomly split into two groups, prisoners and guards. These two groups formed the basis for their social identities throughout the experiment. Zimbardo and his lab converted the basement of the psychology department into a simulated prison environment. The 12 prisoners were arrested, strip searched, sprayed down, chained, and placed into a prison uniform. Instead of being referred to by their names, they were assigned a number, which of course is a classic strategy of dehumanization. The 12 guards were instructed to maintain law and order in the prison, Cameras recorded their interactions. Almost immediately, the prison guards began to take advantage of the structural power that was assigned to them within the simulation. They began to punish the prisoners for even the slightest sign of disobedience. Initially, Zimbardo and his team planned that the experiment would last a full 14 days. In fact, they had to cut it short after only 6 days. As the participants settled into their dominant and subordinate social roles, a strong sense of antagonism emerged between members of the two groups. On the second day, the prisoners rebelled by barricading themselves into their cells and removing their numbers. The guards, feeling that their authority was being challenged, used a fire extinguisher to put down the rebellion. As time went on, they began to viciously harass and bully the prisoners, again emboldened by their dominant social status. The guards employed a classic divide and conquer strategy by creating a privileged class of prisoners. This increased their sense of control and augmented their aggression. All of the participants, including Zimbardo and his team, became immersed in the simulation. At one point, one of the families even called a lawyer to get their son out of this prison, even though none of it was real. But it became real in their minds. Over the course of those 6 days, the prison guards proved to be sadistic authority figures. They work to psychologically break down, demoralize, and dehumanize the prisoners to the point where they had mental crises. The behavior on the part of the guards was so appalling that Zimbardo finally stepped in and called the experiment to an end. Like Milgram's experiment, Zimbardo showed that latent within all of us is a dark side just waiting to be unleashed. He showed that extreme inequality between the in-group and the out-group can result in an almost unfathomable viciousness. With that, I leave you with this picture. I want you to look at it and think about what it says about us as a species. Although Zimbardo's experiment was never recreated, there is evidence of it everywhere. In real prisons, in the workplace, at the school playground, between nations and cultures. This picture was taken at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. It shows an Iraqi prisoner effectively being subjected to extreme psychological torture. And bear in mind that this is one of the tamer pictures. Under the right circumstances, we as human beings can be unspeakably evil. We can dehumanize and degrade each other in ways that are so dark and disturbing that they are almost impossible to think about. There is a darkness deep down in every one of us. Sometimes we are able to suppress this darkness, but other times it overcomes our better nature.